The solicitor's office smelled of old paper and older money. Philippa Wren noticed this the moment she walked through the door, that particular scent of documents that had been folded and refolded so many times their edges had gone soft, of leather chairs that had absorbed decades of difficult conversations, of a room where fortunes had been decided and families had been quietly destroyed. She had been in many such rooms. She recognized the smell the way some people recognize danger. She was the last to arrive. This was not an accident. She had timed it precisely, not to make an entrance, but because she had learned, over 37 years of being a Wren, that arriving early to a family gathering meant enduring the performance of warmth before the performance of grief. She had no appetite for either this morning. The room held 7 people arranged across 2 sofas and 3 individual chairs, and not one of them looked at her when she entered. Her mother, Claudette, sat nearest the window in a charcoal wool dress that was, Philippa noticed, brand new. Her Aunt Marjorie occupied the larger sofa alongside her husband Gerald, whose tie was the exact shade of the family crest, a coincidence Philippa doubted was coincidental. Her cousins Dominic and Fletcher sat together with the studied casualness of men who had already discussed what they intended to say. And beside the solicitor's desk, half turned away as though examining the bookcase, stood her brother Rupert. Rupert, who had called her 2 days ago to say, "Don't make this difficult, Pip." She had not replied. She set her bag down on the single remaining chair, a smaller one, slightly apart from the others, which she suspected had been arranged that way deliberately, and sat without removing her coat. The coat was a practical dark navy, nothing dramatic. She had chosen it that morning the same way she chose most things, for function, not appearance. She had her father's eyes and her grandmother's patience, and absolutely none of either parent's talent for theater, which in a family like hers had always been the most significant disadvantage. Philippa, her mother acknowledged her with a tilt of the chin. Not darling, not even her name said warmly, just the syllables, precise and cool, the way one might identify a document. "Mum." Rupert turned from the bookcase. He was 41 and looked it today in a way he usually didn't, the gray at his temples more visible. Something around his eyes that might have been sleeplessness or guilt, or simply the strain of managing a performance for this long. He gave her a small, careful smile. "Good, we can begin," said the solicitor. His name was Mr. Alderton. He was 60-something, precise, with the kind of deliberate neutrality that professional men cultivated over decades of delivering news that ruined relationships. He had served the Wren family, or more accurately, served the Wren estate, for nearly 30 years. Philippa had met him once before, briefly, at her father's 65th birthday dinner. He had shaken her hand and said nothing memorable. She had noted at the time that he looked at her father with something she could not quite name. Not respect, exactly. Something more careful than that. He opened the folder before him. "I'll dispense with the formalities for now," he said, "as I understand the family is aware of the general structure of Sir Edmund Wren's estate." General structure. Philippa kept her face still. Her father, Sir Edmund Wren, had died 11 days ago of a cardiac event in his study at Hallow Court, the family seat in Northumberland. He was 73. He had been, by most public accounts, a moderately distinguished man, a retired architect of some reputation, a contributor to several restoration projects of national significance, a quiet philanthropist, a knighted gentleman who wore the honor with appropriate modesty and privately found it somewhat embarrassing. He had been married to Claudette for 45 years. He had 2 children, Rupert, who managed the family property holdings, and Philippa, who did not. What Philippa did was something the family had never quite been able to explain to their satisfaction. She had studied structural engineering at UCL, then quietly completed a 2nd degree in law that nobody had been told about until it was done. She had spent the last 12 years working for a firm called Halcott and Gray, a name that meant nothing to anyone in the family, which suited her perfectly well. She lived in a flat in Islington that she owned outright. She did not attend many family dinners. She did not explain herself. Her father had understood her better than anyone, or so she had believed. "The estate," Mr. Alderton continued, "comprising Hallow Court and its grounds, the London property on Cadogan Square, the investment portfolio held under Wren Holdings Limited, and various items of personal and historical significance, has been bequeathed as follows." He paused, not for effect, Philippa thought, for breath. He was the kind of man who breathed carefully before difficult sentences. Hallow Court, including the grounds and all structures thereon, passes entirely to Mr. Rupert Edmund Wren. Claudette exhaled. Marjorie's hand found Gerald's knee. The London property on Cadogan Square passes to Mrs. Claudette Wren in its entirety, to be maintained as her primary residence or disposed of at her discretion. Of course, Claudette said softly, as though this was merely confirmation of what she already knew. Because it was, Philippa realized. They all already knew. She was the only one in this room for whom any of this was information. The investment portfolio, currently valued at approximately £4.2 million, is to be divided equally between Mr. Rupert Edmund Wren and Mrs. Claudette Wren. Dominic shifted in his seat. Fletcher examined his hands. Personal effects and items of sentimental value are to be distributed at the discretion of Mrs. Claudette Wren, with the exception of— Mr. Alderton paused again, and this time Philippa caught it, the infinitesimal hesitation. The architectural drawings, professional correspondence, and research materials held in Sir Edmund's study, which are to pass to Miss Philippa Elena Wren. Silence. Philippa looked at Mr. Alderton. He was looking at the folder. That's it, Rupert said. He said it the way someone says a thing they already know the answer to, not asking, performing asking. In summary, yes. So Pip gets the papers, Dominic said from the sofa, and something in his voice was not quite laughter but was adjacent to it. Dad's old drawings. Dom, Fletcher said, not in rebuke. In warning. Philippa said nothing. She was watching Mr. Alderton, who still had not looked up from the folder, and she was thinking about the way he had paused before listing what she was to receive. Not a natural pause, a braced one. The pause of a man delivering a line he has rehearsed and is still not comfortable with. Are there any questions? Mr. Alderton asked. I have one, Philippa said. Every head in the room turned toward her. She had barely spoken since arriving, and something about her tone, unhurried, completely level, seemed to settle across the room like a change in air pressure. Is this the complete will? She asked. The document in its entirety. Mr. Alderton looked at her now. For the first time since she'd entered, he looked at her directly, and she saw it again, that careful thing in his expression. Not professional neutrality, something underneath it. It is the will as registered, he said. As registered, not yes. When was it last amended? She asked. A fractional pause. The will was last amended in February of this year. February, Philippa repeated. And the version prior to February, when was that drawn up? Philippa, her mother's voice was a warning dressed as weariness. This isn't the moment. What version was that? Philippa continued, addressing Mr. Alderton as though her mother had not spoken. I'm not able to discuss prior versions of the document, he said. The registered will is the operative document. Of course, she picked up her bag. Thank you, Mr. Alderton. She stood, buttoned her coat, and left. She sat in her car for 11 minutes before starting the engine. Not because she was crying. She was not crying. She sat because she needed to organize what she knew, what she suspected, and what she could not yet prove into 3 separate columns in her mind, and this was a process that required stillness. What she knew, her father had amended his will in February, 8 months before his death. He had, according to everything she had just witnessed, left her nothing of material value. The family had assembled today already knowing this. Rupert had called her 2 days ago not to offer comfort but to preempt confrontation. And Mr. Alderton, a solicitor of 30 years' standing, had answered her question about the completeness of the will with a legalism, not a confirmation. What she suspected. The will had been amended under pressure, or under influence, or because something had changed in February that she did not yet know about. What she could not yet prove, everything that mattered. She started the engine and drove north. Hallow Court was a 7-hour drive from London, and she had made it so many times in her life that she could do long stretches of it without conscious thought. The motorway unspooling through the Midlands, the landscape flattening and then rising again, the sky getting larger the further north you went until by the time you crossed into Northumberland it felt less like sky and more like the actual atmosphere of the planet made visible. She had always found this clarifying. Today she found it necessary. She had not told anyone she was going. She had not been to Hallow Court since Christmas, 8 months ago, February, she thought. February. The timing was almost certainly not coincidental. She had come at Christmas with a bottle of wine and left after 36 hours, because the particular tension that existed between her and her mother had calcified over the years into something that made extended visits physically uncomfortable, like spending too long in a room with a low ceiling. Her father had walked her to the car when she left. He had held her hand on the gravel drive and said, "I need to tell you something, Pip. Not today, I'm not ready, but soon." She had thought at the time that he meant something about his health. His heart had been troubling him since the autumn, and he deflected questions about it with the cheerful stubbornness of a man who found the body's vulnerabilities personally embarrassing. She had said, "Whenever you're ready, Dad." And she had driven away. He had not called. He had sent one letter, a brief thing, handwritten, saying only that he was thinking of her and that she should, when she had time, look more carefully at the architectural drawings he'd done for the Hartley Commission restoration project. She had filed the letter away and thought, "I'll ask him about it at Easter." There was no Easter. She reached Hallow Court at 7:30 in the evening. The house sat at the end of a long, pale gravel drive, framed by a stand of old beeches that were losing their leaves in the October dark. It was a substantial Georgian building, not grand in the showy sense, but solid, considered, built to a human scale that her father had always said was the mark of architecture that respected its inhabitants. He had loved this house with a particular quietness, not the love of ownership, but the love of someone who understood what a thing was made of. The house was dark except for 2 windows on the ground floor. She had expected this. The staff, such as they were, had been given leave during the family's period of bereavement. Only Mrs. Hartley, the housekeeper, who had worked at Hallow Court for 22 years, had remained. It was Mrs. Hartley who opened the door. She was a small, substantial woman of 60-odd years, with gray hair pinned back, and the expression of someone who had been waiting and was relieved, but also concerned that relief had arrived. She took one look at Philippa standing on the doorstep with her overnight bag and said, "I thought you'd come." "Has anyone else been here?" Philippa asked. "Mr. Rupert came on Monday, spent 2 hours in the study." Mrs. Hartley stepped back to let her in. "Took a box of things." "What kind of things?" "Papers, mostly, some of the folders from the lower drawer." She hesitated. "I wrote down what I could see, thought it might be useful." She produced a small spiral notebook from her apron pocket, the handwriting inside precise and careful. "I hope that was right." Philippa took the notebook and looked at the list. "That was exactly right," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley." "Your father was a good man," Mrs. Hartley said. It was not a platitude. She said it the way you state a fact that needs stating. "He was," Philippa agreed. She went to the study. Her father's study was on the ground floor at the back of the house, overlooking the walled garden. It was a large room made to feel smaller by the density of its contents. Shelves of architectural books and professional journals, a wide central desk of ancient oak, a drafting table still tilted at the angle he had always preferred, a single armchair by the fireplace with a worn patch on the left armrest where his hand had rested for decades. The room smelled of him. Not his cologne, he had not worn one, but of pencil shavings and paper, and the particular warmth of a room that had been inhabited with consistency over many years. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she crossed to the filing cabinet beside the desk. 4 drawers, dark metal, labeled in her father's precise architectural hand, and opened the lower drawer. Empty. She opened the second drawer. Mostly intact, correspondence files, invoices, insurance documents. She opened the third. Project folders alphabetically organized, spanning 40 years of work. She opened the top drawer and found exactly what she expected to find. The things Rupert had not recognized as significant: personal letters, sketches, the small miscellany of a man's intellectual life. She sat at the desk and opened the letter that was sitting on top. It was not addressed to her. It was addressed to no one, a draft or a document written for its own sake. Her father's handwriting, but slower than usual, more deliberate. The hand of a man choosing his words. "There are things I should have said earlier and didn't, and I suspect this is the form those things will have to take now. The situation with the estate is more complicated than it appears, and by the time anyone reads this carefully, I hope the complexity will be explicable. The drawings for the Hartley Commission are not what they appear to be. They were never only about the restoration project. I was asked to include certain documentation within the architectural plans. a practice I undertook with full legal awareness and with the counsel of a solicitor who is not Mr. Alderton. The reason I could not speak plainly is a reason I hope, by now, has become unnecessary. She read it twice. Then she went to the shelf that held the project folders for the Hartley Commission, a restoration project her father had completed 11 years ago, a Georgian country house in Cumbria that had been partially destroyed by fire. 3 folders, each thick with drawings and technical specifications. She pulled the first one and opened it on the desk. At first glance, it was exactly what it appeared to be: architectural drawings of extraordinary precision and care, her father's draftsmanship at its most meticulous. Floor plans, elevations, sections, details. She turned through the pages slowly. On the 14th page, she stopped. The drawing was of the restored East Wing's ground floor. It was technically impeccable. But in the lower right corner, where architects typically place their title block, the small box containing the drawing number, date, scale, and author, her father had done something unusual. The title block was present and correct, but beside it, so small that it would require reading glasses or close examination to notice, was a second tiny block that at first appeared to be a continuation of the technical notation. It was not. It was a grid of letters and numbers, 17 characters wide, 6 rows deep, precisely formatted, deliberately embedded. She photographed it with her phone, then she turned to the next drawing. Every drawing in all 3 folders had one. Some were larger, some smaller. Each was different. Each was precisely placed in the title block corner as though it belonged there, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She sat back in the armchair and looked at the fireplace. Her father had been hiding something in plain sight for 11 years. And he had left it to her. She stayed at Hallow Court for 3 days. She told no one where she was. She charged her phone in the kitchen and spent her evenings eating the meals Mrs. Hartley left outside the study door, and her days working through the drawings with a magnifying glass and a notebook, recording each embedded sequence. She photographed everything twice, once with her phone, once with the small digital camera she kept in her bag for site visits, a habit from her engineering work that she had never been able to justify giving up. By the end of the first day, she had established that the sequences were not random. They had a structure mathematical, she thought, or possibly linguistic, not a simple cipher, something more layered. By the end of the second day, she had noticed something else. 3 of the drawings in the second folder, numbers 14, 17, and 22, were different from the others. The embedded sequences were longer, the formatting slightly different. And in each case, the sequence was accompanied by a tiny symbol in the margin that was almost invisible, a small figure of a bird in flight, a wren. Her father's signature, not his professional one, a private one. On the evening of the 3rd day, she called a number she had not dialed in almost a year. It rang 4 times before a man answered. His voice was measured and careful, the kind of voice that had trained itself out of expressiveness. "Halcott," he said. "It's Philippa Wren," she said. "I'm sorry to call you directly. I need to speak to someone about a matter that's become urgent." A brief pause. How urgent? She looked at the drawings spread across her father's desk. Someone has already removed documents from the study. I believe the will was amended under duress or deception in February. And I think my father spent the last 11 years encoding financial or legal documentation inside his architectural drawings because he did not believe it was safe to store it any other way. A longer pause. "I'll come to you," he said. His name was Callum Halcott, and he was the senior partner of Halcott and Gray, which was not, as the family had always assumed, a firm that dealt in property law or financial management, or any of the other respectable and unexciting areas of practice that people assumed when Philippa said she worked in law. Halcott and Gray specialized in asset recovery, financial fraud investigation, and the legal dismantling of inheritance schemes. Philippa had worked for them for 12 years. She held qualifications in structural engineering, law, and forensic document analysis. She had, in the last decade, been involved in 14 major inheritance fraud cases, 9 of which had involved the manipulation of wills. None of her family knew this. They knew she worked in law. They assumed it was something dull. They had never asked, because asking about Philippa's life in detail required an interest in Philippa's life that the family, in their various ways, had never quite managed to sustain. Callum arrived at Hallow Court the following morning in a dark green estate car that looked unremarkable and was not. He was 54, Scottish by origin, with the kind of face that people tended to forget immediately after meeting him, which was professionally useful. He had been in rooms with some of the most dangerous financial criminals in the country and been consistently underestimated by all of them. He stood in the study doorway looking at the drawings spread across the desk and said nothing for a long moment. "He was extraordinary," he said finally. "You knew him?" Philippa asked. "We met twice, briefly." He walked to the desk and picked up one of the drawings, examining the title block corner. "He came to us about 2 years ago, said he needed to speak to someone about a financial matter involving his estate and his family. He chose his words very carefully. He said he believed there had been a systematic diversion of assets from a family trust established in 1987, and that he had spent the better part of a decade documenting it." Philippa was very still. "Which trust?" Callum set the drawing down. "The Wren family settlement, established by your grandfather, Theodore Wren, in 1987. Original value approximately £9 million in assets and property. It was structured as a discretionary trust with 3 primary beneficiaries, your father and his 2 siblings. But there was a 4th beneficiary named in the original deed." He looked at her. "You," he said, "by name. You were 6 years old in 1987. Your grandfather had you specifically named as a primary beneficiary with an equal share to the others. The trust was designed to pass to you on your 35th birthday, or upon your grandfather's trustees certifying that you had reached sufficient maturity, whichever came first." "I'm 37, Philippa said. "Yes," said Callum, "you are." She sat down in the armchair. Outside, the beech trees were shedding the last of their leaves in a slow October drift, and the light was that particular northern light that made everything look both very clear and very far away. "No one ever told me about a trust," she said. "No," said Callum, "they didn't. That's rather the point." He pulled a chair to the desk and sat down. "When your father came to us 2 years ago, he had already traced a series of transactions that he believed had been used to systematically drain the trust over a period of approximately 20 years. He had documentation, professional documentation, embedded in his architectural work precisely because he believed his personal papers were not secure, and because he knew that if he kept anything in a format his family or their advisors could easily access, it would disappear." "Who drained the trust?" Callum looked at her steadily. He believed the primary orchestration came from 2 sources. The first was your Aunt Marjorie's husband, Gerald Forsyth, who had served as a trustee of the Wren family settlement since 2001. The second was Mr. Alderton. The solicitor, the man who had answered her question about the will's completeness with a legalism. "Alderton has managed this family's legal affairs for 30 years, she said. "Yes, and during that time he has also served as a trustee. And during that time, according to what your father documented, approximately £6.8 million in trust assets have been restructured, redirected, or simply removed from the settlement in ways that were designed to be invisible to anyone who wasn't looking very carefully. £6.8 million. And the will amendment in February," Philippa said. "Your father believed that Rupert had been told something, not the full picture, but enough to make him compliant. He was told that there were irregularities in the estate, that it was in everyone's interest to finalize things cleanly, and that the best outcome for the family would be a will that distributed assets straightforwardly without raising questions about the trust. Rupert didn't know about me being named in the trust. Your father believed not. He thought Rupert was frightened and maneuvered, not a primary actor." Callum paused. "He was less certain about your mother." Philippa looked at the window, the beech trees, the clear, cold light. "He left me the drawings," she said. "He left you everything," Callum said. "He left you 12 years of evidence embedded in 67 architectural drawings, documented with a precision that is, frankly, remarkable. He left you a letter in his handwriting. He left you the beginning of a trail that, if properly followed, leads to a very clear picture of what happened to a trust that should have become yours 2 years ago. And the will, the actual will, can it be challenged?" On grounds of undue influence and fraud, yes. It's not simple and it won't be fast, but yes. He looked at the drawings. With what's in these pages, yes. Philippa stood up and walked to the window. Below, the walled garden was wintergray, the rose beds cut back and waiting. Her father had planted those roses in the first year they'd moved to Hallow Court. She was 4 years old. She remembered following him along the beds carrying a trowel that was too big for her hands, and him telling her that the secret to roses was not the planting but the patience, that you had to trust the thing you'd put in the ground and not dig it up every 5 minutes to check on it. She had not understood what he meant. She understood it now. "How long have you known he was my father's solicitor on this matter?" she asked. "The other one, the one who wasn't Alderton." "Since he told us," Callum said, 2 years ago. "And you knew he'd died?" "Yes." "And you knew who I was to him?" A pause, "Yes." She turned from the window. "Why didn't you call me?" Callum was quiet for a moment. "Because he asked us not to. He said you'd come when you were ready. He said—" He stopped. "He said, she'll find the drawings. She's the only one who'll know what to look for because she's the only one who thinks the way I think." Philippa looked at the desk. The 67 drawings spread across the surface of the oak desk where her father had worked for 30 years. "Right," she said. She picked up her notebook. "Let's start at the beginning." The sequences took 4 days to decode. Not because they were beyond her, they were not, but because her father had built in deliberate redundancy, layering 3 separate encoding systems across the 67 drawings so that any single system, discovered in isolation, would appear incomplete. It was the kind of thing an architect would do. Not a cryptographer's flourish, not the elaborate vanity of someone who wanted to seem clever, but the practical caution of a man who understood structure. If one beam fails, the others carry the load. Philippa worked at the desk from 6 in the morning until the light failed each evening. Mrs. Hartley brought meals she ate without tasting. Callum Halcott had returned to London with photographs of all 67 drawings and a team she had never met but trusted, because Callum did not hire people he had reason to doubt, and she had worked alongside his judgment for 12 years without finding it wanting. He called her each evening at 9. The calls were short and factual. This suited them both. The first encoding system was numerical coordinate references mapped against an index that her father had embedded in the title block of the very first drawing in the series, the foundation plan for the East Wing. The index looked, to anyone examining it, like a scale reference. It was not. It was a key. Each number in the sequences corresponded to a page number in a document, and each document was referenced by a 2-letter code that she spent the better part of the first day identifying. The documents were trust records. Specifically, they were the annual statements of the Wren family settlement from 2001, the year Gerald Forsyth had been appointed trustee, to 2019, the year her father had completed the Hartley Commission drawings. 18 years of records, compressed into numerical references embedded in the title blocks of 67 architectural drawings, each reference pointing to a specific line on a specific page of a specific statement. The lines he had flagged were transactions. She built a spreadsheet on her laptop, inputting each reference as she decoded it, and by the end of the second day, the spreadsheet had 247 rows. Each row was a transaction. Each transaction on its own was unremarkable, the kind of movement of assets that any trust might make in the normal course of its administration. Investments restructured, properties transferred, management fees paid. Nothing that would raise immediate alarm. But across 247 transactions over 18 years, a pattern emerged that was anything but unremarkable. The assets moved in a consistent direction. Not dramatically, never in a single large transfer that would attract attention, but in small, incremental redirections, like water finding a gradient. Properties were sold, and the proceeds invested in vehicles that performed, coincidentally, very well for certain parties and very poorly for the trust. Management fees were charged at rates that were technically within the parameters of the trust deed, but which sat, consistently, at the highest permissible end. Loans were extended from the trust to 2 companies that Philippa did not recognize at interest rates below the market standard, and those loans had never been repaid. She put the 2 company names into a search on the 3rd morning. The first was a property development company registered in 2004. Its sole director from incorporation until 2009 was listed as G.R. Forsyth. In 2009, Gerald Forsyth had been replaced as director by a woman named Constance Ellery, whose professional history, as far as Philippa could establish, was otherwise entirely invisible. The company had made one significant development, a residential conversion in Harrogate, and had then become dormant. The loan from the Wren family settlement to this company, extended in 2005, was for £480,000. It remained outstanding. The second company was older, registered in 1999, and its directorship was more complex, running through 3 names over 15 years, none of which she immediately recognized. But its registered address was the same building as Mr. Alderton's firm. She sat with that for a moment. Then she photographed the search results and sent them to Callum. He called back in 20 minutes rather than waiting for the evening call. "The second company," he said without greeting. "We've been looking at that. It's a management vehicle. It was used to channel the advisory fees from the trust's investment restructuring. Every time the trust's portfolio was reorganized, the fees went through that vehicle. And Alderton has a connection to it. His brother-in-law was a director from 2003 to 2014. That's not Alderton directly." "No," Callum said. "It's not. That's rather the point. Every connection in this structure is 1 degree removed. Every transaction has a legitimate surface explanation. What your father did, what he spent a decade doing, was document the pattern. Not the individual acts, which are defensible in isolation, but the trajectory, the cumulative effect." "The total," Philippa said. "6.8 million, yes. That's what we calculate has been effectively redirected from the trust over 18 years. Some of it as fees and management costs that were technically permissible. Some of it as loans that were never repaid. Some of it in asset disposals where the pricing was," a brief pause, "generous to the buyer." "Who bought the assets?" 3 separate purchasers, all traceable with sufficient time and effort to the same network of connections. "Gerald Forsyth's network." "And Alderton's, yes." Another pause. "Philippa, the trust deed, the original 1987 document, named you as a primary beneficiary with an equal share. That share at the trust's original valuation was approximately £2.2 million. With 30 years of proper investment management, it should be considerably more." "What is it now?" "The trust," Callum said carefully, "has a current value of approximately £340,000. She did the arithmetic without effort. It was not a comforting exercise. "I want to see the original trust deed," she said. "I've requested it. There's a complication." Of course there was. "The deed is held by Alderton's firm," Callum said. "As the trust solicitor, they have custody of the original document. I've made a formal request through our firm. They have 14 days to respond." "They'll use every day of those 14. "Yes, but in the meantime," she heard him moving papers, "your father was thorough. Among the materials he lodged with us 2 years ago was a photocopy of the trust deed. His copy, the one his father gave him in 1987 when the settlement was created." "And does it name me?" "Section 4, subsection 3, Callum said. "Philippa Wren, date of birth 14th March 1987. Named as a primary discretionary beneficiary with a protected interest in the residuary estate of the settlement, vesting on her 35th birthday or upon trustee certification of maturity, as defined in Schedule B." She had turned 35 2 years ago, in March, while she was in the middle of a case in Edinburgh and had spent her birthday eating a supermarket sandwich in a conference room. Nobody had called. She had not found this particularly unusual. Her family's relationship with her birthday was, at best, inconsistent. She had assumed it was simply another year in which it had slipped their minds. It had not slipped their minds. On the 4th morning, she cracked the second encoding system. It was simpler than the first, deliberately so, she realized, because it was meant to be the confirmation layer rather than the primary evidence. Her father had embedded a series of initials and dates in the drawing's annotation fields, disguised as standard specification references. Each initial was a name. Each date was a meeting. She cross-referenced the initials against the correspondence files she'd found in the second drawer of the filing cabinet. Most of the correspondence was professional, project-related client letters, planning authority exchanges. But interspersed through it, filed with no particular distinction from the surrounding material, were 12 letters, not from clients. From a firm she didn't recognize, Pemberton and Ash solicitors with a Leeds address. She opened the first letter. It was dated March 2012 and was addressed to her father at Hallow Court. Dear Sir Edmund, further to our meeting of 14th March, I write to confirm the matters we discussed regarding the Wren family settlement. We have reviewed the documentation you have provided, and are in agreement that the transactions identified give rise to serious concerns regarding the proper administration of the trust. We would advise that before any formal action is considered, you continue to document the pattern of transactions as fully as possible, and that you maintain this documentation in a form that is. The letter was in full, but the next page was missing. She checked the envelope, empty. She checked the folder around it, nothing. But she had the date, March 2012. She had the firm, Pemberton and Ash, and she had the initials in the drawing dated to that period, MP, which she now read as a solicitor at Pemberton and Ash, a meeting that had been documented in the only way her father felt safe documenting it. He had been working on this for 14 years, perhaps longer. She gathered the 12 letters and photographed each one, then sat back in the armchair. The fire Mrs. Hartley had lit that morning was burning low. Outside, the first rain of the week was beginning against the windows, a gray Northumberland rain, the kind that settled in for the day without drama or announcement. Her father had loved this weather. He said it made thinking easier. She thought he was probably right. She was thinking about February, about the will amendment, about Rupert's phone call 2 days before the reading. Don't make this difficult, Pip. She had assumed at the time that he was simply nervous, that he knew she'd been left less than expected and was preemptively managing her reaction. But that reading now seemed insufficient. Rupert had called too deliberately, with too much specific calm, to have been simply anxious. He had been warned, or briefed, or managed. By whom? She picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for her call. Pip. I'm at Hallow Court, she said. A pause, I know. I've been going through Dad's study. Right, his voice was careful, the voice of a man on a call he knew might matter. I'd like to talk to you, she said. Not on the phone, can you come up? Pip, I don't think. I'm not angry with you, she said, and she wasn't. She was many things, focused, determined, cold, with a kind of disciplined rage that she kept at a distance because it was more useful at arm's length. But she was not angry with Rupert. He was, she was increasingly certain, a man who had been maneuvered into a position he didn't fully understand. I have some information I think you need, that's all. A longer pause. I'll come Thursday, he said. Thank you. She hung up and returned to the drawings. Rupert arrived on Thursday afternoon in the large black car he always drove, looking tired in the way of someone who had not slept well for several weeks. He stood in the entrance hall of Hallow Court with his coat still on, and looked at his sister with an expression she had seen before on other people in other circumstances. The expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that they've started to wonder if they're carrying it correctly. She brought him to the study. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the desk. The 67 drawings were still spread across it, though now they were organized, annotated, cross-referenced, numbered in her neat handwriting. Her laptop was open. Her notebooks were stacked. The room looked like what it was, a working investigation. What is all this? He said. Sit down, Rupert. He sat in the armchair. She sat at the desk and looked at him. What do you know about the Wren family settlement? She asked. Something moved behind his eyes. Its grandfather's trust was wound up, or I thought it. He stopped. What do you mean? It hasn't been wound up. It's still active. Its current value is approximately £340,000. She watched him. When grandfather established it in 1987, it was worth £9 million in assets. Rupert stared at her. What happened to the rest? He said. But she could tell from the way he said it that some part of him had known there was a rest, had known there was a question, and had chosen not to follow it. That's what I'm finding out, she said. Gerald Forsyth was appointed as a trustee in 2001. Mr. Alderton has served as trustee since the trust's inception. Over the following 18 years, the trust's assets were systematically redirected through a network of connected companies and transactions. She kept her voice flat and informational. Dad documented it. He spent over a decade documenting it. The documentation is in the drawings. Rupert looked at the desk. At the 67 drawings. Dad hid it in the drawings. Yes. Because he didn't think, Rupert stopped. He didn't think his papers were safe. No. From who? She looked at him steadily. He understood. She could see the moment he understood. A slow, settling recognition, the kind that changes the arrangement of someone's face. Gerald, he said. And Alderton. Pip, he stood up, moved to the window, turned back. He was a man who needed movement when he was thinking, always had been. Gerald is Aunt Marjorie's husband. He's been part of this family for 30 years. He's been at every Christmas, he stopped. The will, the amendment in February. Who spoke to you about the will amendment? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. Alderton called me in January. He said Dad had asked him to review the estate structure, that there were some complications with the original will that Dad wanted to address before. He stopped again. He said Dad was concerned about ensuring the main assets stayed in the family cleanly. He said Pip had her own life, her own career, that Dad felt she wouldn't want the burden of the estate. He looked at her. He said Dad had told him directly. Did you speak to Dad about it? Rupert's expression answered before he did. I spoke to Mum. She said it was what Dad wanted, that he'd told her he'd discussed it with you. He hadn't spoken to me about it. I know that now. What did you think at the time? He was quiet again. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the light through the windows was the low, pale, exhausted light of a late October afternoon. I told myself it made sense, that you'd never been interested in the estate, that you had your own. I told myself it made sense. You told yourself a story that was easier than the alternative. He flinched, but he didn't deny it. Rupert, she waited until he looked at her. I need to know everything Alderton said to you, every conversation from January until now. I need you to write it down, dates, everything you remember. Can you do that? What are you going to do with it? I'm going to prove what was done to this trust, challenge the will on grounds of undue influence and fraud, and ensure that Gerald and Alderton face the appropriate consequences. He stared at her. You can't just Pip. Alderton has managed this family's legal affairs for 30 years. Gerald is. I know who they are, she said. I know exactly who they are, and I know precisely what they've done. What I need to know is whether you're going to help me. He looked at the drawings. He looked at her notebooks. He looked at her, at his sister, who he had never quite understood and had never tried hard enough to understand, sitting at their father's desk with 12 years of work in her eyes. What is it you actually do? He said. Your firm, Halcott, and what is it? Halcott and Gray, she said. We recover assets, we investigate inheritance fraud, we dismantle the structures people build to take money from families. He absorbed this. You've been doing this for 12 years, he said. Yes. And Dad knew. Dad knew. And he came to you, not you, but your firm. He came to my firm 2 years ago. He asked them not to tell me. He said I'd find my way to it. Rupert sat back down in the armchair. He put his face in his hands for a moment, not weeping, just a gesture of a man receiving the weight of several truths at once. Then he dropped his hands and looked at her. Tell me what you need, he said. She drove back to London on Friday. She had what she needed from Hallow Court, the drawings, photographed in their entirety, the 12 letters from Pemberton and Ash, the correspondence files, Mrs. Hartley's careful notebook, and now Rupert's promise of a written account of every conversation with Alderton since January, which she expected on her desk by Monday. She also had a call, received as she was loading the car on Friday morning, from a number she didn't recognize. She answered it, Philippa Wren. A silence slightly too long. Then, Miss Wren, this is Gerald Forsyth. She had been half expecting this. Not this soon, but the logic was inevitable. Rupert had come to Hallow Court. Rupert had spoken to her. And the information would have moved in the way information always moved in a family where someone was paying attention to which way the wind shifted. Gerald, she said, I understand you've been spending some time at Hallow Court, going through your father's things. His voice was the voice of a man who was accustomed to being the reasonable party in a conversation. A warm, measured, patrician voice that managed to convey concern and authority in the same breath. I wanted to reach out in a spirit of family. I know this is a difficult time." "That's kind of you," she said. "Your father was a complicated man," Gerald said. "I think you know that he had He had some concerns towards the end that sometimes got away from him a little. The heart condition affected him more than people knew." She waited. "I suppose what I'm saying," Gerald continued, "is that if you found anything in those papers that's given you cause for concern, I'd hope we could discuss it. As family, before anything else." "What kind of thing might I have found?" she asked. Another pause. He kept records in a somewhat unorthodox way. Some of his notes, taken out of context, might appear to suggest, things that aren't quite accurate. "I see," she said. "I only want to make sure you're not drawing the wrong conclusions from something that could be easily explained." She opened the car door and set her bag on the seat. "I appreciate the call, Gerald. I'll be in touch." She ended the call before he could respond. She sat in the car for a moment. He had called within 18 hours of Rupert's visit. He knew she had been in the study. He was already constructing the framework of a defense: her father's mental capacity, unorthodox records, context, explanation. He was, she thought, quite good at this. He had been doing it for a very long time. She started the engine. He was not good enough. Back in London, the pace changed. Halcott and Gray occupied the third and fourth floors of a building in Holborn that looked from the outside like any other professional services firm. A discreet brass plate, clean windows, nothing that announced its specific purpose. Inside, it was organized with the focused efficiency of an organization that dealt habitually in complexity. Philippa had a desk on the fourth floor, in a corner with a window that looked east. The walls around the desk were covered, on most days, with documents and photographs and timelines. Her colleagues had long since stopped finding this unusual. She spent Saturday and Sunday building the case structure. This was a process she understood viscerally, not just intellectually but physically, the way an architect understands a building. A case like this one had structural requirements: foundation, the primary legal instrument, the trust deed, load-bearing elements, the evidence of systematic misadministration, and the connections between them, the pattern of transactions documented in the drawings. Everything else, the witness accounts, the correspondence, the company searches, was material, important but secondary to the structure. By Sunday evening, she had three things clear in her mind. First, the case against Gerald Forsyth and Alderton was strong on the asset diversion. The documentary evidence her father had created was extraordinary in its detail and consistency, and Callum's team had, over the weekend, independently corroborated several of the key transactions through companies' house records and land registry searches. The pattern was demonstrable. Second, the will challenge was more complex. Undue influence cases required establishing that the testator's free will had been overborne, that her father had not made the amendment freely. The fact of the amendment happening in February, following what appeared to be a period of managed access by Alderton to her father's affairs, was suggestive, but suggestive was not sufficient. She needed either direct evidence of what had been said to her father in January and February, or evidence that his capacity or freedom of decision had been compromised. Third, someone had taken documents from the study. Rupert had not taken the materials from the lower drawer. He had confirmed this when she asked him directly, and she believed him. Someone else had accessed the study. Someone who had a key to Hallow Court or access to one. She added a fourth task to the list she was building: find out who had been at Hallow Court between her father's death and her own arrival. She called Mrs. Hartley. "Mrs. Hartley, you mentioned Mr. Rupert came on Monday. Was there anyone else? In the days immediately after my father died." "Mr. Alderton came on the Saturday," Mrs. Hartley said. "The day after that was. He said he needed to collect some papers that related to the estate. Legal papers, he said. Saturday, 3 days before Rupert's visit, before the will was read, before Philippa had even arrived." "Did he go to the study?" "He did. He said it was necessary. I'm sorry, Miss Wren, I should have." "You didn't do anything wrong," Philippa said. "He's the family solicitor. You had no reason to refuse him access." She paused. "Can you remember anything he took?" "I didn't go in with him. He was in there about an hour." A pause. "He did carry a briefcase when he left. It looked heavier going out." "Thank you, Mrs. Hartley." She made a note, Alderton at Hallow Court, Saturday, 12th October. Study access approx. 1 hour, briefcase. Then she made another note. What was he looking for? Did he find it? The drawings had still been there when she arrived. That meant either Alderton hadn't known about them, hadn't known they contained anything, or had looked and not found what he was looking for, or had taken what he needed and left the rest. What would he need? She thought about the 3 folders of the Hartley Commission drawings, the ones with the longer sequences, the ones marked with the tiny Wren symbol. 3 drawings specifically, numbers 14, 17, and 22. She went to her photographs and pulled up drawing number 14. The embedded sequence in this one was different from the others in a way she hadn't fully unpacked yet. The other sequences were referential. They pointed to other documents, to transactions, to records. Drawing 14's sequence was positional, a series of coordinates that didn't map to any transaction she'd identified. She'd set it aside as anomalous. She stared at it now. The coordinates were not financial, they were physical. Map coordinates, she'd half recognized their format earlier and hadn't followed the instinct. She put them into a mapping application now. The coordinates resolved to a location in Cumbria, not far from the Hartley House Restoration Project site, close enough to be connected, far enough to be distinct. They resolved with some precision to a property, a small cottage on a rural track, barely visible on the satellite image. She looked at the name of the track on the map. Wren Lane. She sat very still for a moment. Then she looked at drawings 17 and 22. Both contained positional sequences. Drawing 17 resolved to an address, a building in Leeds. Drawing 22 resolved to a set of GPS coordinates in Northumberland, within a mile of Hallow Court. 3 locations, each one embedded in a drawing, each one marked with the tiny Wren symbol that was her father's private signature. She picked up the phone and called Callum. "I need someone to check 3 locations," she said without preamble. "I'll send you the coordinates." "Physical locations." "Yes, I think my father may have had secondary storage. Physical documents, not just the encoded records in the drawings. Places he felt were secure." "A beat. How soon do you need this?" Alderton was at Hallow Court the day after Dad died. He had an hour alone in the study. He took something. If he knows about these locations, or if he figures it out, the materials there could disappear. "I'll have people out tomorrow morning," Callum said. "Monday morning." "I'll have people out this evening," he said. "Send me the coordinates." The Cumbria location yielded results first. At 10:30 on Sunday evening, Callum called her with the report from the field team. The cottage on Wren Lane was a property her father had purchased in 2007, in the name of a small company she'd never heard of, a company with no obvious connection to the Wren family. The cottage had been maintained but was not regularly occupied. Inside, in a locked room at the back, the field team had found a fireproof safe. The safe contained documents. Callum described them as the team photographed and listed them. Correspondence between her father and Pemberton and Ash spanning 14 years. A complete set of annual trust statements, originals going back to 1987. A valuation report commissioned in 2018 on the assets that had been divested from the trust, establishing their value at the time of disposal. And one document that Callum read out in full, slowly, carefully, because of what it was. It was a letter written by her father, addressed to Philippa Wren with the date left blank. "If you are reading this, then things have proceeded as I feared they might, and I am not available to explain them in person, which is a failure I regret more than I can adequately say here. The trust your grandfather established in 1987 was his most considered act. He loved you before you were old enough to know he did. He put your name in that document himself," he said. "Theodore, I want that child to have something of her own, something no one can take from her. It is the greatest irony of my adult life that I watched what he intended for you be taken from you slowly, across 20 years, and could not find a way to stop it that did not risk making things worse. I have tried to be careful. I hope I have been careful enough. I also want to say, separately from all of this, I was not a perfect father. I don't believe I understood you well enough when you were young, and I don't believe I defended you as I should have in this family. Your intelligence frightened people. It shouldn't have, but it did, and I made the mistake, for too many years, of letting that fear shape how I presented you, how I stood up for you, how I made space for you. You were always the most capable person in any room you were in. I knew this. I did not always show I knew it. I am sorry. The evidence is in the drawings. The context is in this safe. The legal advice is from Pemberton and Ash in Leeds. Ask for Margaret Pemberton. She knows everything I knew and possibly more. Do what you think is right. You always have. Your father, Edmund. Callum stopped reading. Philippa was sitting in her flat in Islington in the dark because she hadn't turned the lights on when the sun went down and had not noticed. The city outside her window was doing what the city always did, moving, bright, entirely indifferent, and she sat with the phone pressed to her ear and the letter in the air between her and the dark window. Philippa, Callum said. I'm here, she said. I'm sorry, he said, not professionally, the way people say it when they mean it. Don't be, she said. He left me everything I need. She reached over and turned on the lamp. What's in Leeds? She asked. Margaret Pemberton was 71 years old and had been practicing trust law in Leeds for 43 years. She had the kind of reputation that exists in professional circles largely by word of mouth. Clients came to her through recommendation, rarely through advertising, because the work she did was the kind that did not benefit from visibility. She had a small firm of 6, an office on a Georgian terrace near the city center, and the particular authority of a woman who had spent 4 decades being smarter than the men who had underestimated her. Philippa drove to Leeds on Monday. Margaret Pemberton met her in a conference room overlooking a garden. She was a compact woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain and eyes that were, in the precise sense of the word, shrewd, not sharp or cold, but well calibrated, accustomed to assessing situations accurately. Your father spoke of you often, she said when they had sat down. He was proud of you. He found it difficult to express, but it was very present. He found many things difficult to express, Philippa said. Yes, a small, understanding inclination of the head. He came to me first in 2010. He had noticed the trust was performing below what he would expect given the asset base, and he had begun trying to understand why. He was, you'll appreciate, not a solicitor or a financial professional, but he was a very intelligent and very methodical man, and he had done a remarkable amount of work before he came to me. She folded her hands on the table. I confirmed his suspicions within 6 months. What had been done to that trust was, well, it was not crude. It was the work of people who were careful, and who had considerable experience in making things look legitimate. Alderton. Primarily, yes. Gerald Forsyth provided the operational means, the company structures, the transactions, the access to the trust's assets through his trustee position. But the legal architecture was Alderton's. He knew exactly how to structure each transaction so that it would withstand individual scrutiny. The vulnerability was always the pattern, and the pattern required a long view to see. Which my father had. Which your father had, she paused. The question for many years was how to act on it. A legal challenge required evidence that was, forgive the indelicacy, bulletproof, because Alderton is well-connected. Gerald Forsyth is well-connected. They would have resources. They would have the capacity to mount a vigorous defense, to challenge evidence, to attack credibility. She looked at Philippa steadily. They would attack your father's capacity, his mental health, his reliability as a witness. They would have done it without mercy. So he kept documenting. He kept documenting, 14 years, and he developed, with my guidance and with the guidance of a forensic accountant, I brought in a case structure that addresses every foreseeable line of defense. She opened a folder on the table. I have, between this office and your firm's current work, what I believe is a complete evidentiary package, the trust deed, the transaction records, the valuation reports, the corporate structures, the correspondence. She paused. And your father's letter, which establishes intent, his understanding of what was happening, and his mental clarity, which is why he dated it 3 separate times, had it witnessed by 2 independent solicitors, and included in the letter a summary of the evidence with sufficient detail to demonstrate that he understood precisely what he was describing. A brief, precise smile. He was thorough. He was an architect, Philippa said. He built things to last. Yes, the smile held. He did. On Tuesday, everything changed. She was back in London, at her desk on the 4th floor, when Callum appeared in the doorway. He was not a man who moved quickly. His pace was always deliberate, but his expression had the particular quality of someone who has received important information and is organizing how to convey it. "Alderton has filed an application," he said. She looked up. "What kind?" "He's applied to the court for a declaration confirming the validity of Sir Edmund's will as amended. He's also applied for an order directing the Wren family settlement trustees, himself and Forsyth, to proceed with the formal wind-up of the trust." She set down her pen. "He's accelerating. He knows you've been at Hallow Court. He knows Rupert has been in contact with you. He knows—" Callum paused. "Gerald called Rupert on Sunday evening, apparently, after your brother had already committed to providing the written account of his Alderton conversations. And Rupert did not, from what I understand, tell Gerald very much. But the fact of your visit and the fact that you've been working in the study is now clearly known to them. They're trying to get ahead of it," she said. "If the will is formally confirmed and the trust wound up before we can file, it becomes significantly harder to—" "Not impossible," Callum said. "But yes, harder. The wind-up of the trust would distribute the remaining assets, the 340,000, according to the current trustee interpretation of the deed, which, given the trustees are Alderton and Forsyth, would almost certainly not include you." She looked at the window. "East toward the city. How long do we have before the court hears those applications?" she asked. "The will validation, potentially weeks. The trust wind-up, the application is on a fast-track basis. He's claiming urgency. The first hearing could be as early as next month." She picked up her pen. "Then we file this week." Callum looked at her. "We file what exactly?" "Everything." She turned back to her desk. "We file the challenge to the will on grounds of undue influence and fraud. We file an application to have both Alderton and Gerald removed as trustees on grounds of breach of fiduciary duty and conflict of interest. We file an injunction to prevent the trust's wind-up pending the challenge. And we file," she wrote as she spoke, "a formal complaint with the Solicitor's Regulation Authority regarding Alderton. That's 4 filings. By Thursday." Callum was quiet for a moment. This was not unusual. He processed things internally, visibly, his expression moving through a sequence that ended in decision. "It's aggressive," he said. "They filed first," she said. "They chose the pace. If we move this fast, they'll know exactly how prepared we are." "Good," she said. "I want them to know." He looked at her. "Why?" She looked up from her desk. "Because people who are confident in their position don't panic. And if Gerald and Alderton understand what's coming, understand the full extent of what my father documented, there's a possibility one of them makes a mistake. Or consolidates their position. Or consolidates. Yes, but Callum," she paused, "Gerald Forsyth has been doing this for 20 years and has never faced a serious challenge. He's confident to the point of complacency. And Alderton," she thought of the pause before as registered, the careful legalism of a man managing a difficult moment. "Alderton has been in legal practice long enough to know exactly how much trouble he's in. He is not as comfortable as he appears." "You think he'll crack?" "I think he'll overreact," she said, "which is different from cracking but equally useful." Callum considered this. Then he said, "I'll get the litigation team in at 8 tomorrow morning." 7, she said. He almost smiled. 7. She worked until 2 in the morning on Tuesday night and was back at her desk at 6. The filing documents were complex, not in the sense of being difficult, but in the sense of needing to be exactly right, because in a case like this one, the first filing set the terms. A weak initial document gave the opposition room to characterize the challenge as a grieving daughter's overreach. A strong one established, from the first paragraph, that this was a professional case with professional evidentiary foundations, and that the person bringing it was not a bereaved amateur but someone who understood precisely what she was doing and had the documentation to support every claim. She wrote the will challenge herself. It ran to 38 pages. It set out the history of the Wren family settlement, the evidence of systematic misadministration, the timeline of her father's documentation, the circumstance of the February amendment, and the specific grounds for challenge. Every statement was referenced. Every reference was to a document she could produce. The narrative was dry and precise and completely devastating. She read it back at midnight and made 4 amendments, all of them tightening rather than expanding. Then she sent it to Callum. He replied at 12:47 a.m. "This is very good." She replied, "It needs to be more than good." He replied, "It is." She went to bed at 2 and woke at 5, which was normal for her during a case. Her mind ran on two tracks during intensive work periods: the conscious track that slept and ate and moved through the world, and the deeper track that continued working, surfacing results at inconvenient hours. She had learned to keep a notebook beside the bed. The notebook this morning had 2 entries from the night, written in her sleep hand, which was worse than her normal hand but legible. Drawing 22, Northumberland coordinates. What's there? And below that? Mother. She stared at the second word for a while. Her mother, Claudette, who had told Rupert that the will amendment was what Edmund had wanted, who had sat in the solicitor's office in a brand-new charcoal dress and received the reading of the will with the composure of someone who had rehearsed for it, who had been married to Edmund Wren for 45 years and had lived alongside the Wren family settlement for just as long and might know things that had not yet been asked of her, or might be implicated in ways that had not yet been fully considered. She did not know which. She put the notebook on her desk and went to make tea, and while she was standing in her kitchen waiting for the kettle, she looked at the city in the early morning dark and thought about her father walking her to the car at Christmas. "I need to tell you something, Pip. Not today, but soon." He had known in December that he was running out of time. Not because he was dying, she didn't think he had known that, but because the situation was reaching a critical point. He had been managing it for 14 years. He had been building a case. He had been waiting for the right moment or the right strength or the right certainty, and by December he had reached the edge of his own capacity to wait. "She'll find the drawings." He had said that to Callum 2 years ago. "She's the only one who'll know what to look for." He had believed in her before she believed in herself. She poured her tea and went back to her desk. The Northumberland coordinates from drawing 22 resolved, on closer examination with a detailed ordnance survey map, to a specific point on the Hallow Court estate itself. Not the house, the grounds. The east boundary of the garden near the old wall. She called Mrs. Hartley on Wednesday morning. "The east garden wall," she said. "Is there anything there, a storage structure, a gate, anything that might?" "There's the old ice house," Mrs. Hartley said immediately. "Sir Edmund had it restored about 12 years ago. It's built into the wall. He used it for, well, we always said he used it for garden tools, but to be honest, I never saw many garden tools in there." A pause. "He had a padlock on it. I have the key. He gave me a copy years ago, said it was in case he ever lost his." Philippa was already pulling up her diary. "I'm coming back up," she said, "tomorrow." She drove to Northumberland on Thursday morning and reached Hallow Court by early afternoon. Mrs. Hartley met her at the door with the key to the ice house, an old iron key, heavy, clearly original to the structure, and walked her through the walled garden to the east wall. The ice house was set into the base of the wall, a low, arched entrance, the door old but solid, the hinges recently oiled. The padlock was new. She opened it and went inside. The interior was cool and dry and unexpectedly large. The ice houses on Georgian estates were designed for function, not appearance, and this one went back further into the wall than the entrance suggested. Someone had installed simple shelving along one wall. The shelving held garden tools, as advertised. But at the back, behind a second internal door that she would not have found without looking for it, there was a room. The room held a single filing cabinet, locked, and a small wooden crate. The crate held 12 bottles of wine, her father's particular preference, a Burgundy from a single estate he had bought by the case for 30 years. And beneath the bottles, cushioned in straw, a hard drive in a waterproof casing with a handwritten label. The label said, "PW complete." She carried the hard drive and the filing cabinet key, which was taped to the underside of the crate, back to the house, and set them on the desk in the study. The filing cabinet, when opened, held exactly what she expected, the final layer of her father's documentation. Not the encoded drawings, those were the evidence structure. Not the correspondence, that was the context. This was the capstone, a complete annotated financial analysis of the Wren family settlement from 1987 to 2020, prepared not by her father alone, but, she could see from the professional formatting, with the assistance of the forensic accountant Margaret Pemberton had mentioned. The analysis was signed. The accountant's name was Dr. Francis Lowe. The signature was dated June 2020. She picked up her phone and called Callum. "My father had a forensic accountant working on this," she said. "Frances Lowe. She signed off on the financial analysis in 2020. A brief silence. "We know Frances Lowe," Callum said. "She worked on the Brightwell case. She's one of the best in the country." "She's in this?" Dad brought her in. "There's a complete financial analysis, annotated in a filing cabinet in the ice house at Hallow Court." "The ice house?" "He restored it 12 years ago, used it as a secure location." A pause. He thought of everything. "He was an architect," Philippa said. "He thought in structures." She opened the hard drive casing. Inside the casing, alongside the drive, was a USB stick. She plugged it into her laptop and opened the folder. It contained, as far as she could assess in the first 10 minutes, a complete digital archive of everything in the ice house. All of Frances Lowe's analysis, all the trust statements, all the correspondence with Pemberton and Ash, plus one additional file she had not expected. It was a video file. She opened it. Her father was sitting at his desk, the oak desk in the study, and the camera was positioned as though on a tripod. He was in his study clothes, the old corduroy jacket he wore at Hallow Court. He looked well. This had been filmed, she calculated from the date stamp, in March 2020, 3.5 years before he died. He looked directly at the camera. "Hello, Pip," he said. She sat very still. "If you're watching this, then things have gone wrong in at least one of the ways I was afraid they might. I want to explain some things, and I want to say some things, and I'm going to say the saying things first because I've spent too long in my life prioritizing the explaining things." He paused. He put his hands flat on the desk, the way he always did when he was being deliberate. "You deserved better from this family. You deserved better from me. You were the most remarkable child I had ever met, and I let other people's discomfort with that shape how I treated you, which was a cowardice I am not proud of." She looked at the desk surface, at her hands. "The trust your grandfather made for you is real, and what happened to it is real, and the evidence is complete, and you will win. I believe that without reservation. You will win because you are competent and prepared and honest, and the other side is none of those things." He looked at the camera. "I also want you to know that what I should have said at Christmas, what I nearly said and didn't, was that I am proud of you. Not proud of what you've accomplished, though I am. Proud of who you are. There's a difference." He paused again. "The ice house is also where I kept the Burgundy," he said. "The 2009, it should be ready by now." He almost smiled. "Be careful, trust Pemberton and Pip." He looked at her through the lens. "Don't let them make this about grief. It was never about grief. It's about what's right." The video ended. She sat in her father's armchair for a long time. Outside, the beech trees had finally given up the last of their leaves, and the garden was winter bare, the wall exposed, the ice house door visible from where she sat. The light was going. The room was cooling. She did not move to turn the fire on. She sat and she thought, and when she was ready, she stood up and went back to the desk and opened her laptop. There was work to do. The filings went in on Friday. All 4 of them will challenge, trustee removal application, injunction, SRA complaint, delivered simultaneously to the appropriate bodies, each one complete and supported and referenced. The litigation team at Halcott and Gray had worked through the night on Thursday. She had reviewed every document by 7 on Friday morning. By 9, they were filed. By 10:30, Alderton's firm had received notice. By 11, she had a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered, Philippa Wren. "Miss Wren," said a voice she didn't know, male, professional, slightly tense. "My name is Christopher Hale. I'm a partner at Radnor Pemberton LLP. I've been instructed by our client, Mr. Gerald Forsyth, to contact you." Alderton had not called himself. He had sent a solicitor. "I see," she said. "Our client would very much like to explore whether there might be a resolution to this matter that avoids the necessity of." "Mr. Hale," she said, "I've filed 4 documents this morning. Those documents represent the complete case that will be placed before the court. If your client has instructions he would like to explore, he is welcome to instruct you to make a formal offer, which I will consider. But I won't be taking calls." She paused. "Particularly not on a Friday morning within 2 hours of our filings." A brief silence. I understand. I'll convey that to our client. Please do, she said, and ended the call. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she called Rupert. The filings are in, she said. A pause. I know, Alderton called me. What did he say? He said you'd misunderstood your father's intentions, that the documents and the drawings were taken out of context. He said Dad had been unwell mentally, and that some of his fears about the trust were a symptom of that. A pause. He sounded frightened. Did he? She said. Rupert hesitated. He's going to go after Dad's reputation, his mental state. That's his line of defense. I know, she said. That's why Dad made the video. What video? I'll explain when I see you, she paused. Rupert, thank you for the written account, the one you sent Monday. It's not much. It's more than you know, she said, and she meant it. Rupert's account of his conversations with Alderton, the specific language Alderton had used, the assurances he'd given, the way he had framed the will amendment as Edmund's own explicit wish, was precisely the kind of testimony that would, in court, contrast vividly with everything the documents showed. A man who had said to Edmund's own son, "Your father wanted this," while simultaneously administering the destruction of a trust Edmund had spent 14 years trying to prove had been stolen, was not a man who had a comfortable position before a judge. What happens next? Rupert asked. They respond to the filings, she said. They make their case, and then, she looked at her laptop screen at the 4 confirmation receipts sitting in her inbox, then we make ours. The first hearing was on a Tuesday in November. It was not the main event. Hearings rarely were at this stage. This was procedural. The court would consider the injunction application to prevent the trust's wind-up, hear preliminary arguments on the will challenge, and set a timetable for the full proceedings. It was the kind of hearing that lawyers attended in working clothes, not their best ones, and that produced outcomes measured in weeks and directions rather than verdicts. Philippa wore her dark navy coat. Courtroom was small, a chancery court in the Rolls building, functional and unhurried, with the particular quality of rooms that have absorbed decades of careful argument and settled into a kind of procedural gravity. She sat behind counsel, a barrister named Harriet Good, whom Callum had instructed and who had spent 20 years in trust and estate litigation, and had the kind of focused composure that came from having been in many difficult rooms and never losing her head in any of them. On the other side of the aisle sat Alderton's team. 2 solicitors she didn't recognize and a barrister she did, Marcus Flint, who was senior and expensive and who had a reputation for effective demolition of witness credibility. He was a good choice, which told her something about how seriously Alderton was taking this. Men who are not frightened do not retain Marcus Flint. Alderton himself was not present. Gerald Forsyth was not present. This was noted. The judge was a woman named Mrs. Justice Carroll, who was somewhere in her late 50s, with reading glasses and a manner that was brisk without being harsh. The manner of someone who had no patience for theater but considerable patience for substance. She read the filed documents at the outset with the focused attention of someone who reads quickly and retains everything. Then she looked up. Miss Good, she said, the injunction application. Harriet rose. My lady, the applicant seeks an injunction restraining the current trustees of the Wren family settlement from proceeding with the wind-up application pending the resolution of the main challenge. The grounds are, in summary, that the trustees are themselves the subject of the breach of fiduciary duty allegations, that their proceeding with a wind-up would have the practical effect of defeating the applicant's claim before it can be heard, and that the balance of convenience strongly favors preservation of the status quo. Mr. Flint, Mrs. Justice Carroll said. Flint rose with the measured ease of a man who is accustomed to being given the floor. My lady, the respondent's position is that the injunction is premature and that the applicant has not established a sufficiently strong prima facie case to justify the restriction of the trustees' legitimate administrative functions. The trust has been winding down for some time, and the applications filed by the respondent trustees predate the current challenge. By how long? The judge asked. The trustees' wind-up application was filed, Flint consulted his papers, on the 25th of October. And the applicant's challenge was filed when? The 31st of October, my lady. 6 days later, the judge's expression did not change, and the applicant's father died on the 11th of October. So the trustees filed their wind-up application 14 days after the death of one of the trust's principal beneficiaries and 6 days before the challenge was lodged. She looked at Flint. In your submission, that timing is coincidental. A fractional pause. The trustee's position is that the wind-up had been under active consideration for some time prior to Sir Edmund's death. I see. She looked at the papers again. I've read the applicant's filings. There are 67 architectural drawings referenced as containing embedded documentary evidence. Has that evidence been reviewed by the respondents? We've had limited time. The drawings have been in existence for 11 years, the judge said. Mr. Flint, I'm going to grant the injunction. The balance of convenience is overwhelmingly in favor of preservation pending a full hearing. I'm also going to direct that the respondents provide full disclosure of all trust records within 21 days, and that the applicant's forensic accountant have access to the trust's financial records for the same period. She looked at her diary. I'll list the main hearing for February. That gives both parties 3 months. She looked up at the room. This is a serious case, she said. It was not a question. I want it prepared seriously. The 3 months were serious. Philippa did not sleep much. She was not, in the ordinary way, a person who required much sleep. 5 hours had always been sufficient for her. But during the preparation period, she functioned on less, and on more coffee than was strictly advisable, and on the particular focus that came from working on something that mattered in a way that was both professional and entirely personal. The disclosure process revealed more than she had expected, which was not nothing. She had expected a great deal. The trust records produced under court order were, in themselves, largely consistent with what the drawings had documented. The pattern of transactions was there, confirmed in the official records, navigable now with the annotated analysis that Francis Lowe had prepared. What the disclosure added was the correspondence, the internal correspondence between Alderton's firm and Gerald, Forsyth's various company structures, spanning the years of the trust's administration. Most of it was careful, professionally drafted, the work of people who had always assumed they might one day need these letters to look innocent. But there was one letter that was not careful. It was an email, technically, sent from Gerald Forsyth's personal account to Alderton's personal email address in September 2019, recovered from the disclosure of electronic records. It was brief. The old man is getting close. He mentioned the Pemberton firm to Marjorie at dinner. We need to move the remaining Lambert Holdings position before year-end. R doesn't know and doesn't need to. C can manage her end. G. See Claudette, her mother. She read the email 3 times, then put it in the central evidence folder and sat back in her chair. C can manage her end. She had been careful in the 3 months of preparation not to foreclose on the question of her mother's involvement. The notebook note at 2 in the morning, mother, had remained an open hypothesis rather than a conclusion. She had not raised it with Rupert. She had not raised it with the litigation team, beyond noting that Claudette's position in the proceedings needed to be assessed carefully. The email resolved the hypothesis. Her mother had known, not necessarily the full scope, perhaps not the detailed mechanism of what had been done to the trust, but she had known enough. She had known that Edmund was getting close to something, and she had been part of the management of that situation. She can manage her end was not the language of an innocent bystander. It was the language of a participant. She called Callum. The Gerald email, she said. I know, he said. I read it this morning. She knew. It appears so, yes. Philippa looked at the wall of her office, the timeline, the documents, the photographs, the complete structure of 14 years of evidence assembled and ordered and ready. Does it change the case? It complicates the picture, Callum said carefully. It doesn't weaken the primary claim, if anything. It explains the will amendment, she said. February, Alderton called Rupert, told him Edmund wanted the will simplified. But someone also had to manage Edmund himself, had to make him compliant or distracted, or simply present the amendment as something he'd already agreed to. Alderton couldn't do that alone. He needed someone with access. His wife, Callum said. His wife, she was quiet for a moment. She was with him every day in January and February. He was unwell, the heart condition. She would have been managing his medical appointments, his schedule, She stopped. I need to know more about his medical records from that period. We can apply for disclosure. It'll take time. Do it, she paused. And Callum, I want the February amendment examined by a handwriting expert, the amendment document itself. A brief silence. You think his signature? I think my father was a careful, methodical man who spent 14 years documenting a fraud because he did not trust the people around him, she said. I want to know whether the signature on the February amendment is consistent with his handwriting from that period. That's all. I'll arrange it. She looked at the email again. She can manage her end. She thought about her mother sitting in the solicitor's office in a brand new dress. The composed tilt of the chin. Philippa, just the syllables. She thought about Christmas, her father walking her to the car, the way he had held her hand on the gravel drive and said, I need to tell you something, Pip, not today, but soon. He had been in the house with her mother every day since Christmas. He had been managing his heart condition. He had been, she thought now, frightened, not of dying, of not having enough time to get the information to where it needed to be. He had made the video in 2020. He had lodged materials with Callum in 2022. He had hidden the final archive in the ice house and the drawings in plain sight. He had done everything he could across 14 years to ensure that what had been taken from her could be reclaimed. And then, in the last months of his life, in January and February, something had happened that made him amend the will. She needed to know what. The handwriting analysis came back in December. The expert was a woman named Dr. Alicia Shore, who worked in forensic document examination and had testified in over 200 court cases. Her report was 32 pages long and concluded, with what she described as a high degree of certainty, that the signature on the February will amendment showed signs of being executed under conditions of physical or cognitive stress inconsistent with Sir Edmund Wren's established signature pattern, as evidenced by 12 years of comparative documents. Specifically, the pressure, letter formation, and pen lift patterns in the amendment signature were consistent with those observed in signatures produced by individuals experiencing medication effects, illness. Or, the phrase she used was careful but clear, impaired voluntary control. The medical records, when produced under the disclosure order, showed that Edmund had been prescribed a new cardiac medication in January. A beta blocker. The side effects included, among others, fatigue, cognitive slowing, and in a small percentage of cases, mild confusion. He had signed the will amendment on the 14th of February. He had been on the new medication for 3 weeks. She drove to Claudette's house in Kensington on a Wednesday morning in January, 6 weeks before the hearing. She had not told her she was coming. She considered it and decided against it, because a call in advance allowed for preparation and performance, and she had seen enough of her mother's performances to know they were considerable. Claudette answered the door herself. The housekeeper had the morning off. It emerged, and the look on her face when she saw Philippa on the step was the most honest expression her daughter had seen from her in years. Not surprise, exactly. More like the look of someone who has been watching a storm approach from a distance and has now registered that it is going to be very close. Philippa, she said. Can I come in, Mum? A pause, then she stepped back. The house on Cadogan Square was impeccable, as it always was. Her mother's aesthetic sense was one of the few things Philippa had always genuinely admired. Cool colors, good proportions, nothing excessive. They sat in the drawing room, and Claudette arranged herself in the armchair nearest the window with the instinctive stagecraft of a woman who had been managing rooms her entire adult life. I suppose this is about the case, Claudette said. It is, Philippa said. I want to talk to you before it gets to February, because once we're in court there are things that can't be unsaid, and I think you deserve the opportunity to understand what's coming. Her mother looked at her with an expression that was not quite cold and not quite frightened, and was, Philippa thought, the expression of a woman who had spent 45 years being managed and managing others, and was not entirely certain which side of that dynamic she was on at this moment. Your father, Claudette said, and then stopped. Yes, Philippa said. Your father was, she stopped again. Her hands in her lap adjusted their position, a small, involuntary movement. He was obsessed, for years, with distrust with what he believed had happened to it. I genuinely tried in the early years to understand what he was saying, but it was so, she paused. It was so consuming, it took him away. Not physically, but he was always in that study, always. He was building a case, Philippa said. I know that now. Her voice was careful. I didn't at the time. It seemed like Gerald kept saying it was a fixation, that Edmund was reading things into the records that weren't there. Gerald has always seemed so. She stopped. Reasonable, Philippa supplied. Yes. Gerald managed you, Philippa said. Not unkindly. The same way Alderton managed Rupert. He found the story that you would find most credible, that your husband was obsessed, that he was seeing patterns that weren't there, and he told it to you consistently for long enough that you believed it. Her mother was very still. The email, Philippa said. September 2019. Gerald wrote to Alderton. He said your father was getting close. He said she can manage her end. She paused. What did he ask you to do? A long silence. The room was very quiet. Outside, Kensington was doing its composed, expensive morning routine. He asked me to, he said, if Edmund mentioned anything about a solicitor in Leeds, I should tell him that Edmund's memory was sometimes confused, that he got things muddled. Claudette's voice was very controlled. He said it was for the family. That what Edmund believed he'd found would cause a great deal of trouble and distress and potentially damage the family name, and that the kindest thing for everyone was to manage it. To discredit him. I didn't think of it as that. A pause. I thought I was protecting him. From what? Her mother looked at her hands. From being seen as from people thinking that he had become. Paranoid, Philippa said. Confused, unreliable. Yes. The story they needed people to believe about him, so that if he ever did present his evidence, if it ever got to a court, there would already be a narrative in place about his mental state. Claudette looked up, and in her mother's face, in that moment, Philippa saw the thing she had not been sure she would see. Not guilt, exactly, but the expression of a woman who has received a piece of information that reorganizes everything she thought she understood about a situation, and who is finding the new arrangement very difficult to look at. I didn't know about the money, Claudette said. It was not a defense. It was a fact stated quietly. I knew Gerald and Alderton were involved in managing the trust. I knew Edmund was unhappy about it. I thought... She stopped. I thought it was a disagreement about investment strategy, about management decisions. I didn't know the scale of it. 6.8 million pounds, Philippa said. Her mother closed her eyes. And I was named in the trust from the beginning, Philippa said. Since I was 6 years old, grandfather put me in specifically. I didn't know that either. A pause. Edmund he never told me. Did you ask him about the trust, about what was in it? A very long silence. No, Claudette said. I didn't. I let Gerald tell me what I needed to know. Which was, Philippa thought, perhaps the most important admission of the morning. She looked at her mother, at this woman who had managed her carefully and incompletely for 37 years, who had loved her in the particular limited way of someone who finds another person's nature uncomfortable, who had been, in the end, a tool of the people who had wronged her without. She was now fairly certain, fully understanding what tool she was. I need you to give a witness statement, Philippa said, describing your conversations with Gerald from 2019 onwards, including what he asked you to do and what you did. Claudette stared at her. That would. It would be difficult, Philippa said. Yes, it would be scrutinized. But it would also be the truthful account of a woman who was manipulated into participating in something she didn't fully understand, which is a very different thing from being a knowing party to a fraud. Gerald would. Gerald is going to face the full weight of what he's done regardless of what you do, Philippa said. The question is whether you're a witness to that or a defendant in it. Claudette looked at her. I'm giving you the opportunity to do the right thing, Philippa said. Not because it helps my case, it does, but that's not the reason. Because Dad spent 14 years trying to get to the truth, and he deserved better than what happened in February. And the person who could speak most clearly to what happened in January and February, in that house, in those weeks, is you. A long silence. Then Claudette said, I'll need my own solicitor. Yes, Philippa said, you will. Her mother's witness statement arrived, via her solicitor, on the 28th of January. It was thorough, More thorough than Philippa had expected, 22 pages, detailed, covering every conversation with Gerald from 2018 onwards, every instruction, every story she had been told about Edmund's state of mind, and most significantly, her account of the February events. In January, Gerald had called Claudette and told her that Edmund had expressed a wish to simplify the will, but that he was finding the process stressful due to his health. He asked Claudette to speak to Edmund about it, to raise it gently, to frame it as something that would relieve him of worry. Claudette had done so. She described in the statement sitting with Edmund in the drawing room at Hallow Court on the 3rd of February and raising the will. She described Edmund being tired, very tired, more tired than she had seen him, and saying, "I need to think about it." She described Gerald calling her 2 days later to say that Edmund had agreed to the amendment and that Alderton would be bringing the document for signature on the 14th. "Did you ask Edmund whether he'd agreed?" her solicitor had asked her in the statement's preparation. "No," she had said. "I assumed it was what he'd said." The 14th, the medication, the handwriting analysis. She had not asked. And Edmund, on the 14th of February, tired and medicated, and in a house where the people around him had been managing the narrative of his mental state for years, had signed a document that he may not have fully understood, or may have felt unable to refuse, or may have been presented as something other than what it was. She would never know exactly what had passed in that room. But what she had, the medication records, the handwriting analysis, the pattern of management that preceded it, her mother's account of Gerald's orchestration, was sufficient. More than sufficient. The February hearing was a Monday. She took a different coat, dark gray, slightly better cut than the navy. Not vanity, preparation. She had learned over 12 years that how you presented yourself in a courtroom was not about appearance for its own sake, but about communicating something precise. This is not grief, this is not anger, this is professional certainty. She wanted the court to see from the moment she walked in that she was here as someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Callum met her outside the Rolls building at 8:30. "How are you?" he asked. "Ready," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Your father would have." "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "After, tell me after." He nodded. They went in. The courtroom was larger than the November hearing, a full chancery court, formal, with the gravity of a room designed for consequential proceedings. The public gallery had a small number of people. A journalist she recognized from the legal press, 2 individuals she didn't recognize, and she saw them when she turned briefly, Rupert, sitting in the 3rd row in his good suit, looking like a man who has made a decision and is living with it. He caught her eye. He gave a small nod. She turned back. Gerald Forsyth was present this time. He sat behind his legal team in a dark suit that was very expensive and very controlled, and his expression was the expression of a man performing composure. He was tall, gray-haired, with the physical authority of someone who had occupied important rooms for a long time and expected rooms to accommodate him. When she walked in, he looked at her once, a brief, assessing look, and then looked away. Alderton was not present. This had become, she understood from Callum, a strategic decision by his defense team. His attendance at the hearing would make him a more visible target, and his lawyers had advised him to stay away. The SRA complaint was ongoing. His firm had, in the last month, lost 2 clients. The story was beginning to move. Mrs. Justice Carroll entered at 9 o'clock, and the room stood. The hearing was listed for 3 days. It took 4. On the first day, Harriet Good laid out the structure of the case with the systematic clarity of someone who has complete confidence in her materials. She took the court through the trust deed, the 1987 document, the named beneficiaries, Philippa's protected interest, and then through the history of the trust's administration from 2001, the year Gerald Forsyth had been appointed trustee, and the year the pattern of transactions had begun. She presented Francis Lowe, who spent the afternoon in the witness box giving evidence that was, in its precision, almost architectural. Dr. Lowe had spent 30 years in forensic accountancy and had the quality of someone who had testified many times in difficult cases and had never once been caught in an inaccuracy. She took the court through the 247 transactions Philippa had identified from the drawings, explaining each category, demonstrating the pattern, providing the cumulative total. She did not editorialize. She simply described what the records showed. Marcus Flint cross-examined her for 2 hours on the second morning. He was skilled. He found every possible line of challenge and pressed each one. He challenged her methodology, her assumptions, her interpretation of individual transactions. He suggested that the pattern she described was consistent with legitimate, if aggressive, trust management rather than systematic misappropriation. Dr. Lowe answered each challenge with the same measured precision. She did not become defensive. She did not become impatient. She simply answered the question that was asked, with reference to the specific document or calculation that supported her answer. By mid-afternoon of the second day, Philippa thought that Marcus Flint knew his position was weakening. Not from anything he said, he was too experienced for that, but from the pace of his cross-examination, which had gradually become less exploratory and more compressive, the way a structure shifts under load. On the third morning, Harriet called Margaret Pemberton. She was 71 years old and had been in practice for 43 years, and she walked into the witness box with the authority of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone in this room. She gave her evidence in the same direct, considered way she had spoken to Philippa in her Leeds office, factually, chronologically, without embellishment. She described Edmund's first visit in 2010, his evidence, her own initial assessment, and the steps she had taken to investigate. She described 14 years of work, careful, cautious, building toward a point where the evidence would be complete enough to withstand the challenge that would inevitably come. She described in detail the documents lodged with her firm, the correspondence, the instruction she had received in 2022 from Edmund. If anything happens to me before this is resolved, send everything to Halcott and Gray in London and tell them it's time. Did he indicate what he feared might happen? Harriet asked. He said he was concerned that the other parties had become aware he was approaching the point of action. He said he wanted the materials in a safe place that was not connected to him or to anyone they might have access to. She paused. He was a very calm man. He wasn't frightened, or if he was, he managed it very well. He was simply practical. Did he speak about his daughter? He spoke about her often. Harriet allowed a brief pause. He said she was the most thorough person he had ever met. He said the quality that distinguished her professionally was that she never assumed a structure was sound simply because it appeared sound. She always checked the actual foundations. A slight pause. I thought that was a very precise thing for an architect to say about his daughter. Flint cross-examined Margaret Pemberton for the better part of an afternoon and made essentially no progress. She was the most experienced witness in the room, and she knew it, and she met each challenge with the patient precision of someone who has been doing this since before opposing counsel was born. On the fourth morning, they played the video. She had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it, and she had thought, in the weeks before the hearing, that she would be able to watch it in court with professional detachment. She was wrong. There was something about seeing her father on the courtroom's display screen, sitting at his desk in the corduroy jacket, the study visible behind him, looking directly at the camera with the particular expression she now understood was the expression he'd worn when he was being most deliberate, that she could not be entirely detached from. She kept her face still. She looked at the screen. "Hello, Pip," he said. She heard someone in the gallery make a small sound. She did not look. She kept her eyes on the screen. He spoke for 11 minutes. He described the trust, his concerns, the history of his investigation. He described the embedded sequences in the drawings and explained precisely how they were encoded, demonstrating on a sheet of paper he held up to the camera. He described the contents of the ice house. He referenced Francis Lowe and Margaret Pemberton by name. He described his concern about the security of his personal papers and his decision to use his professional drawings as the secure storage medium, because they were publicly registered works that could not be destroyed without public consequence. Then he put the paper down and looked at the camera. "I want to be direct about one thing," he said. "My mental state, I expect that will be raised. I am recording this on the 3rd of March 2020 in full possession of my faculties. If anyone doubts that, they are welcome to compare what I've described in this recording with the documentary evidence I've prepared, which is complete, accurate, and verifiable. The evidence is not the product of confusion. It is the product of 14 years of careful work. Those are not the same thing." He paused. The people who did this believed they were safe because they were careful, and they were careful, but they were not thorough. There's a difference. He looked at the camera. "That's all I have to say on the record." A pause. "The rest I've already said." The screen went dark. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Then Harriet rose. "My lady, those are the applicant's submissions." Gerald Forsythe's defense lasted a day and a half. His barrister, Flint, had been accompanied by a junior, who took the first morning's defense submissions, and presented the case that the trust's management had been entirely legitimate, that the transactions identified by Dr. Lowe were consistent with proper trustee conduct, and that Edmund's documentation, while impressively compiled, reflected a misunderstanding of trust administration practice rather than evidence of fraud. Then Gerald Forsythe took the witness box. He was composed. She had expected that. He was a man who had been performing composure in professional settings for 40 years, and he did it well. The measured voice, the reasonable manner, the vocabulary of a man who considers himself the most responsible person in any given situation. Harriet rose to cross-examine. She was a careful cross-examiner, not theatrical, not aggressive. She asked precise questions and waited for precise answers, and she had a way of creating silence around an answer that allowed it to sit in the room and be heard fully before the next question arrived. "Mr. Forsythe," she began, "you were appointed trustee of the Wren family settlement in 2001. Is that correct?" "It is." In 2005, a loan of £480,000 was extended from the trust to a company called Ashton Meridian Property Limited. Can you describe the rationale for that loan? The company had a development project that the trustees believed represented a sound investment opportunity for the trust. The company of which you were, at that time, the sole director. A pause. "Yes, I resigned the directorship before the loan was approved to avoid any." "You resigned the directorship on the 14th of March 2005, Harriet said. "The loan approval is dated the 22nd of March 2005, 8 days later." There was a clean break. "The loan has never been repaid." She paused, allowing it. "Is that correct?" "The company encountered difficulties. The company became dormant in 2009. The £480,000 has not been repaid in 20 years. She moved on before he could respond. "In the period 2003 to 2014, the trust's investment restructuring generated management fees totaling approximately £1.2 million. Those fees were paid to a company called Brentford Advisory Services Limited. Who were the principals of that company?" A fractional hesitation. "I wasn't involved in the management of that company." "I didn't ask about your involvement. I asked who the principals were." "I believe there were several directors over the years." The registered address of Brentford Advisory Services Limited was the same building as Alderton and Partners Solicitors, Harriet said. "And the company's sole shareholder was a holding vehicle whose beneficial owner was Mr. Alderton's brother-in-law. Were you aware of that?" A longer pause. "I was aware that there was a connection to the Alderton firm, yes." "Were you aware that the Alderton firm, through that connection, was receiving fees from the trust while simultaneously serving as the trust solicitor and trustee?" "That was a matter it was disclosed in the trust's accounts." "In a footnote," Harriet said, "in technical accounting language that would not be readily comprehensible to a lay beneficiary reviewing the accounts." She paused. "Mr. Forsythe, the September 2019 email, you wrote to Mr. Alderton, 'The old man is getting close. We need to move the remaining Lambert Holdings position before year-end. C. Can manage her end. Who is C?" He was very still. "Mrs. Claudette Wren," he said. "Sir Edmund's wife." "Yes. And what did you mean by she can manage her end?" A long pause. Flint rose to object relevance, he said. Mrs. Justice Carroll looked at him calmly and said, "The relevance is self-evident, Mr. Flint. Sit down." Flint sat. "I meant," Gerald said slowly, "that Claudette could speak to Edmund about his concerns, could help him contextualize things." "You meant that his wife could help ensure that Sir Edmund did not pursue his concerns about the trust's administration." "That's not." "You were asking her to manage the narrative around her husband's mental reliability," Harriet said, "in the event that he made his concerns public." "That is not what I—" "You moved the Lambert Holdings position, as you put it, in December 2019, Harriet said. "Lambert Holdings was an asset in the trust's portfolio. The disposal was made at a price that the valuation report prepared by Dr. Lowe indicates was approximately £340,000 below the market value at that time. She paused. Where did those proceeds go? The composure, which had been maintained very well until this point, shifted, not visibly to the untrained eye. But Philippa saw it, a micro-adjustment in Gerald's posture, the kind that happened when a person recalculated what they could and could not afford to say. The proceeds were distributed according to the trust's investment strategy. To which vehicle? I'd need to review the specific. I can assist you, Harriet said pleasantly. She held up a document. The proceeds were transferred to Northgate Capital Partners Limited, a company registered in January 2019, 10 months before the Lambert Holdings disposal with a single director. She paused. Your son. Complete silence in the courtroom. Gerald Forsyth looked, for the first time, like a man who understood precisely how much trouble he was in. I put it to you, Harriet said, that over the period of your trusteeship, you systematically used your position to divert trust assets to connected entities for your own benefit, in breach of your fiduciary duty to the trust's beneficiaries, including the applicant, who has been a named beneficiary since 1987. He stopped. Do you deny it? A very long pause. I would like to speak to my counsel, he said. You'll have that opportunity, Mrs. Justice Caro said. We'll break for lunch. They did not return after lunch. At 2:15, Flint requested a private conference with the judge's clerk. At 3 o'clock, a message was conveyed to Harriet. Gerald Forsyth's legal team wished to discuss a settlement. Philippa was sitting in a conference room on the building's second floor when Harriet came in and told her this. She looked at Harriet for a moment. What are the terms? She asked. They haven't specified yet. They want a meeting. Tomorrow morning, she said. This afternoon I want to finish the cross-examination. Harriet raised an eyebrow. They're offering. They're offering because they're frightened, Philippa said. The cross-examination isn't finished. I want the record complete. A settlement discussion doesn't stop the proceedings. Harriet looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who respects a position while being aware of its cost. It will extend the hearing. Then it extends. The cross-examination resumed at 4 o'clock and concluded at 5:30. By the end of it, Gerald Forsyth had confirmed under oath the existence of the connected company structures, his awareness of the Alderton firm's fee arrangements, and the Lambert Holdings disposal. He had not admitted fraud, he was too experienced for that, and Flint would have coached him away from any explicit admission. But the record was complete. The pattern was in evidence. The admissions, limited as they were, closed several of the avenues by which the defense might later claim the transactions had an innocent explanation. When they rose at 5:30, Philippa gathered her papers and did not look at Gerald Forsyth. She did not need to. The settlement meeting was at 9 on Friday morning. Gerald's team proposed full repayment of the diverted trust assets, the £6.8 million calculation over a period of 5 years, secured against personal assets, recognition of the applicant's beneficial interest in the Wren family settlement, a joint application to the court to set aside the February will amendment on agreed grounds. And this was the detail that told her most clearly how frightened they were, a formal apology in writing from Gerald Forsyth personally. Philippa read the proposal, then she set it on the table. The 5-year repayment period, she said. No, 2 years fully secured with a charge on the relevant personal assets registered immediately. She looked at Flint. The scope of the will challenge, we're not limiting it to agreed grounds. We're proceeding with the full application, and the court will make the determination. The joint application was intended to limit the court's scrutiny of how the amendment came about, she said. No, the court hears the full evidence. The apology stays, in writing addressed to me and to my father's estate. She paused. And one more thing. Flint looked at her. The solicitor's regulation authority complaint against Mr. Alderton, she said. I will not withdraw it. That is a separate regulatory matter, and I have no intention of treating it as a negotiating item. My client's position is that the Alderton complaint is a related matter. Your client's position is not one I share. She gathered the proposal documents. Subject to the revised repayment terms and the full court determination on the will, I'll consider the settlement. I want revised heads of terms by Monday." She stood. "Miss Wren," Flint said. He paused. In the pause, she heard something she had not expected from Marcus Flint, something that was not quite reluctant respect but was adjacent to it. "The revised terms, the 2-year period, the full hearing on the will, I'll need to take instructions." "Of course," she said. She left the meeting room and stood in the corridor for a moment, alone, looking at the wall. Then she took out her phone and called Rupert. "It's nearly done," she said. Mrs. Justice Carr delivered her judgment on the will challenge in March. The settlement on the trust assets had been finalized in February. Gerald Forsyth had accepted the revised terms, and the charge against his personal assets had been registered within the week. Francis Lowe and Margaret Pemberton had both been present at the signing and had said nothing, but their expressions had said a great deal. The judgment on the will ran to 87 pages. Philippa read it the morning it was handed down, in her office, alone, before she spoke to anyone. Mrs. Justice Carroll found that the February amendment had been procured through the combined effect of undue influence, specifically, the management of Sir Edmund's information environment by Gerald Forsyth, facilitated by Claudette Wren, and the exploitation of a period of diminished capacity arising from his medication. She found that the amendment did not reflect Sir Edmund's free and informed decision. She set it aside. The consequence was that the prior will, the will as it had existed before February, was operative. Philippa read the pages describing the prior will 3 times to be certain she had read them correctly. The prior will, the version that Alderton had declined to describe as other than the version prior to February, in the careful legalism of a man who knew what it contained, had been drawn up in 2019. It had been drawn up with the assistance of Margaret Pemberton, not Alderton. It had been drawn up by a man who understood, by 2019, exactly what the situation with the trust was, and who had made provision accordingly. In the prior will, Hallow Court passed to Rupert. The London property passed to Claudette. The investment portfolio was divided between Rupert and Claudette. Personal effects at Claudette's discretion. And to Philippa Wren, the architectural drawings, the professional correspondence and research materials. And additionally, as a specific bequest, a 1/3 share of the family estate's residuary value, to be calculated after the resolution of any claim arising from the Wren family settlement, specifically including any assets recovered through such claim. A 1/3 share of the residuary value. Her father had written her into the will he didn't trust Alderton to know about. He had made provision for exactly this outcome, for the trust claim to succeed and for her to receive her share of whatever was recovered. He had built the provision around the outcome he believed she would achieve. She sat with this for a long time. The Solicitor's Regulation Authority suspended Alderton's practicing certificate in April, pending a full disciplinary investigation. The investigation was expected to last 12 to 18 months. His firm had by then lost 7 clients, including the Forsyth family accounts. Gerald Forsyth's first repayment installment, representing the transfer of a property he owned in Yorkshire, secured as part of the charge arrangement, was made in May. The transfer was handled by a firm that was not Alderton's. Claudette Wren gave evidence in the SRA investigation, as she had in the court proceedings, and her account was received, her solicitor told her, as that of a witness rather than a participant. Whether that remained the case would depend on the investigation's findings. She had moved from the Kensington house to a smaller flat in Chelsea, which she said she preferred. Philippa did not entirely believe this, but she found she was no longer certain she knew what her mother preferred, and this uncertainty felt, if not comfortable, at least honest. Rupert called her on a Tuesday afternoon in May. "I've been at Hallow Court," he said, "going through some of Dad's things properly. There's a letter for you in the kitchen for some reason. Mrs. Hartley found it in the recipe drawer." "The recipe drawer," Philippa said. She said he used to put things in there because Mum never opened it. Philippa was quiet for a moment. "I'll come up this weekend," she said. She arrived at Hallow Court on a Saturday morning in May when the beeches were in full leaf, and the light was the generous early summer light that made the north look like somewhere else entirely. The walled garden was coming into color, the rose beds, cut back in October, now putting out their first growth of the season. The ice house door was closed. The gravel drive was the same pale gravel it had always been. Mrs. Hartley met her with tea and the letter, which was in a plain envelope with her name in her father's handwriting. She took it to the garden and sat on the old stone bench near the east wall, in the sun. She opened the envelope. It was a single page, handwritten, no date. Pip, if this is in your hands, then either things went well or Mrs. Hartley found it earlier than expected, and you're reading it in some other context, in which case I apologize for the inconvenience. I want to tell you something I've been trying to work out how to say for about 20 years, and have not, for various reasons, managed to say well enough or soon enough. When you were 7 years old, you found a crack in the kitchen wall and told me that the internal lintels above the window openings were inadequate for the structural load they were bearing. You were 7. I had the walls surveyed and you were correct. I told your mother and she said, "How does she know things like that?" And I said I didn't know, but I did know. You knew things like that because you paid attention to how things were actually made rather than how they appeared. That quality has defined everything you've done. I've watched you from a distance and sometimes from closer, and I have been, without exception, more proud of you than I have known how to say. The trust is yours. Whatever it takes to make that true, it is yours, and you will make it true, because you are the most thorough person I have ever met, and thoroughness, in the end, is what everything actually comes down to. The 2009 Burgundy is in the ice house. Please drink some of it. Dad. She sat on the bench for a while. The garden was quiet, a wood pigeon somewhere in the beeches. The sound of the gravel when the wind moved through it, which she had always found inexplicably comforting. The particular quality of light through old beech leaves, green and gentle, making everything look the way things look when you are very young and paying attention. Then she folded the letter and put it in her pocket. She went to the ice house and retrieved one of the remaining bottles of the 2009 Burgundy, and she brought it back to the bench, and she opened it with the corkscrew she had, on instinct, taken from the kitchen drawer, and she poured 2 glasses. She had also taken 2 glasses. She was a thorough person, and she set one glass on the bench beside her and held the other. She looked at the garden, the roses, the east wall. The house, solid and considered and built to a human scale. A building that respects its inhabitants, her father had said. That was the mark of good architecture. She thought about that, about what it meant to build something that respected its inhabitants. To consider in the design not only the structure but the people the structure existed for. He had spent 14 years building that, not in stone or timber, in paper and patience and encoded sequences hidden in plain sight, in letters in recipe drawers, in bottles of wine kept against a specific future. A structure designed to withstand the people who would try to bring it down, and to be found and used by the person it was built for. She raised her glass. You were thorough, she said, to the garden, to the house, to the beech trees losing their light in the afternoon sun. She drank. The final accounting of the Wren family settlement recovery, completed in August, established a total recovery of approximately £7.2 million. The £6.8 million of diverted assets plus accrued interest and costs. Under the terms of the settlement and the prior will's provisions, Philippa's share, after costs and the appropriate division of the residuary estate, was approximately £2.6 million. This was not the number her grandfather had intended in 1987. Nothing could make it that. 30 years of proper investment management, starting from a protected share of a £9 million trust, would have been a different number, a larger number. A life that had been shaped differently by the security it represented. She did not spend much time thinking about the unrealized figure. It was not a useful exercise. What existed was what existed. A completed case, a set-aside will, a recovery of what could be recovered, and a regulatory process that would determine what further consequences followed for the people responsible. What she had, in other words, was what her father had built for her. Not the whole of what she should have had, but as much as could be retrieved, delivered with the precision of someone who had trusted her completely to finish what he started. She sat at her desk on a Thursday afternoon in August, the window open to the east, and looked at the final accounting document. Then she put it in the file. She picked up the next case on her desk. It was a new one, referred by Margaret Pemberton's firm, involving a family trust in Yorkshire and a series of transactions that had begun to raise questions in the mind of a woman who had been told, for 20 years, that she didn't need to worry about such things. She opened the file. She began to read. Outside, the city moved through its late summer afternoon, the sound of it rising through the open window, indifferent and continuous, the way cities are. On the wall to her left, the timeline from the Wren case had been taken down. The space was clean, waiting. She would fill it with something new. She always did.